Welcome to TBG Talks, Expert Insights for Your Business Success, the podcast where we dive deep into the world of accounting and finance, consulting, business, and the employee experience with experts at the Bonadio Group. In each episode, we'll sit down with our firm's thought leaders to discuss the latest trends, challenges, and strategies shaping the industries we serve and the modern-day accounting workforce. Today's episode of TBG Talks is hosted by Laura Myers, Director of Corporate Communications, who is sitting down with our Director of Policy and Legislative Affairs, Jess Ladon. Jess is an expert resource on legislative, political, and policy affairs that may impact our clients' businesses. Jess monitors the ever-changing legislative landscape to ensure our firm and clients are fully informed through clear, concise, and actionable messaging. Jess is here today to discuss how businesses can plan ahead in a time of post-election economic uncertainty. She dives into some of the specific tax policies and potential changes that businesses may need to adjust to, as well as some practical steps for businesses to consider during this time. So without further ado, let's get started.
Hi, Jess. It's so nice to have you here today.
Hey, Laura. Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to do this.
Awesome. Well, so for our listeners who don't know much about you, you have a little bit of a unique background, I would say, for a public accounting firm. You're actually a lawyer. So would you like to tell us a little bit about your background and what led you to this field and just your role as it stands today?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it is different. I really went into law school thinking I was going to be litigating. I was thinking of being a public defender. I wanted to be in a court. I had actually previously worked in a jail. I really saw myself kind of in the courtroom when I went into law school. So, that was really my goal when I started. And then I took a couple tax and contracts and real estate classes that got me really interested in transactional law and statutory law. So that sort of changed my path a little bit, I would say. And then when I graduated from law school and took the bar, the timing really coincided with the implementation of the Affordable Care Act. So as I was, getting out into the world and seeing what I wanted to do with my law degree, there was a niche in kind of regulatory compliance, especially around that new law. So I worked for many years in ACA compliance, helping multi-employer funds and then corporations make sure that their plans were compliant with ACA regulations. So I worked in that area for many years, and that sort of transitioned into more general tax compliance, I would say. So I was working mostly on the corporate side and helping kind of understand other laws and helping businesses make sense of really complicated statutes and regulations and what they needed to do to really kind of bridge the gap between what does this law say and what do we actually have to do in our business day to day. So that's really kind of the path that I took. I also had a really unique opportunity to work with an amazing organization, the National Employment Opportunity Network, for many years. And that allowed me kind of a peek behind the curtain at the federal level. I did some government relations and lobbying on the Hill. So I was able to spend a lot of time on the Hill in offices, meeting with members of Congress and advocating for, at that point, it was incentives to ensure that corporations were hiring people that needed to find a job. So the work opportunity tax credit, other programs that gave people a leg up and helped companies hire those folks. So, I had the opportunity to be on the Hill, which was really special to me. I'm the daughter of a American history teacher and complete history expert. So, I grew up. Actually, so is my husband. So the two of us, we both come from history teacher fathers. We bonded over the fact that our family vacations often had, hours long detours to hit up a battlefield or a presidential grave. So yeah, so
we're gonna have to have a completely separate podcast on like
Right?
history, trivia, and really put you to the test here.
I would love to. Yes, exactly. Yeah, so that was a lot of fun to be able to send my dad selfies from, the basement of the Senate and that sort of thing. So it was great. It was really, really unique. So, and then, I ended up here at Bonadio, and it has been wonderful to kind of use that background decoding complex policies and legislation to help our clients, find ways that they can not only adapt and comply with the law, but also think kind of opportunistically about what's out there that we could be using or taking advantage of or helping to position ourselves in the best way. So I love to do that here at Bonadio, and I help our tax technical teams with all of the laws that impact our clients, which is quite a few.
Absolutely. And I think before we dive into the meat of our conversation today, I think it's just an interesting story for listeners who might be in the accounting field, hearing your background and your path to where you are today, because as you know, there's so much change in the accounting industry. There's a need for different skill sets and different backgrounds. And it's nice to talk to someone that hasn't had maybe the traditional public accounting path to where they are today.
Yeah, that's a great point, Laura. Yeah, I mean, I feel really lucky to be working with such smart people that understand, the actual dollars and cents of a lot of this, because often it's using my legal background and their expertise in accounting, and that is really kind of where the sweet spot is to work together to help our clients in the best way. So yeah, absolutely agree.
For sure. So you are really, based on your background, you're really uniquely positioned to talk about what's going on in terms of the recent election outcomes impact on economic policy and government relations, compliance, regulation, tax, all of that. And I know there's been so much speculation and discussion around the elections potential and probable impact, especially on tax changes and tax regulation. So I know this is a loaded question, but at the highest level, what are your kind of immediate and most important takeaways, in the weeks following the election's outcome when it comes to taxes?
Yeah, yeah, it's a great question, and it is a loaded question, but it is what I've frankly spent every day since we've gotten our election results talking about. So let's dig into it. I mean, 2025 is really going to be a huge year for tax legislation. We obviously have a new incoming administration. We have a new Congress, and it also coincides with the expiration of a ton of provisions that were originally enacted in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act back in 2017. So, kind of the timing of all of those things happening at once is really teeing up a huge year for tax changes. So, specific things that I'm watching, especially around the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions, are things that are set to automatically expire or sunset. So, these are things like bonus depreciation. That's actually one that we've been watching slowly phase down for a couple of years and is set to automatically and fully sunset after the next couple of years, so after 2027. So we're keeping an eye on that, of course. The qualified business income deduction, that's another one with an automatic sunset even earlier at the end of 2025. The SALT deductibility cap that was capped at $10,000 in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. That's another one that's set to automatically expire. So these are things that unless Congress acts, we will see changes no matter what. These are going to automatically sunset. There's provisions on the individual side as well. Standard deduction changes, the enhanced child tax credit. I mean, there's a list of probably around 40 provisions that law enacted a few years ago that are just set to automatically sunset in the next couple of years. Then there's also some provisions that are not set to automatically expire, but were changed in that law. So the corporate tax rate was adjusted. That was brought down for the first time in many years. And we've actually seen President-elect Trump talking about lowering it even further from 21%, maybe down to as low as 15%. The changes to R&D expenses, the amortization of those costs, that's another one that is not set to automatically expire, but is something that a lot of businesses are advocating to be changed back to that pre-Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provision. So same with 163J. There's a ton of provisions that we're watching that we think, based on the fact that we have the clarity now to know that the Republicans will control the White House and both chambers of Congress, that will be watching for potential changes. All of that is speculation at this point as we sit here and talk in December of 24. And it's important to note that, what what presidential candidates and members of Congress say that they want to do and what they actually do are not always the same thing. In many of these changes that they're advocating for or saying that will be priorities will cost a ton of money. So extending those provisions that I just discussed, the estimated cost of extending those is somewhere around $4.5 trillion. So, coming to terms with that price tag and seeing if there are if there's potential pay-fors or offsetting provisions that can allow for those provisions to be passed, we really have to see, what the number is that Congress is comfortable with putting those extensions in place, but also grappling with the fact that we have a national deficit that's, on a trajectory that we simply haven't ever seen before. So how are we going to pay for these extensions? I think that's going to be really the crux of the tax debate that will be happening, at Senate Finance and Ways and Means and all of these committees that I will be watching very closely to see what's going to actually happen. And that's, really just the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. And we can extend this conversation even further. We've seen President-elect Trump on the campaign trail proposing executive orders on tariffs, imposing tariffs right from the start. So, there's other economic provisions that we're watching that could really impact just the economic landscape generally. It could have inflationary impacts. There could be, the potential of retaliatory tariffs. There's all these things that we're watching. So, I'll pause and say there's a lot in the potential pile right now. What will actually happen will depend on what Congress wants to do. The only thing I'll add before I close, because I could talk for hours on this, Laura, every everything except for the tariffs is going to require congressional action. That's going to require, negotiation. It's going to require votes, and that's going to obviously pose challenges. So the one thing to keep in mind is we do have Republican trifecta control on the Hill, which will allow for Congress to move some of these provisions through more quickly via reconciliation. So I'm watching for possible reconciliation process on the Hill that will allow for tax legislation to move through with a simple majority vote, much more streamlined, much less debate, and much less need for bipartisan support. That being said, the majorities that we're seeing both in the House and in the Senate are so thin that there's still going to be need for conversations, negotiations, and deal making to get these bills through. So there's always the potential of gridlock and delays to face these provisions, with the only exception being tariffs, because the president does have more unilateral authority to impose those. So didn't mean to get too off the rails with it. I mean, the short answer to your question is there's a ton that could happen. And right now we're really in a wait and see period and making sure we're prepared for what may happen.
No, I asked you a loaded question. So I expected a lot of detail. And I think our clients and businesses are looking for this level of detail because there is so much speculation and so many opinions about what potentially could happen that, in all honesty, are not facts yet. So I think businesses appreciate the level of detail and transparency that someone like yourself can provide.
Oh, good. Okay. Good. Thank you.
You mentioned things like tariffs, things like changes to tax incentives, like or credits, things like that. For me, that sparks, in my mind, specific industries. But what are there industries that you feel have the potential to be most impacted by potential tax legislation changes? Like, are there industries that need to be more prepared than others?
What a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the short answer to that question is those that are really highly regulated industries. So the ones that I'm watching most closely are financial services, healthcare, labor, manufacturing, construction, industries where we see there's a lot of regulation that impacts them, a lot of tax considerations. And it's not just the new administration and the new Congress and the potential changes that we've been chatting about. There's also a couple of things that make this time in history kind of unique. We actually saw during last summer, the Supreme Court came out with a couple of decisions that really kind of changed the landscape here. So just to touch on those briefly, the Loper Bright case, which I know did make a lot of headlines at the time, it overturned something called Chevron deference. This is something that had been in place for 40 years at the time. But essentially, to really take it to a high level, what this decision did was shift some of the regulatory interpretative power from agencies, so from the IRS, the Treasury, over to courts. So that is a shift. It used to really be that a court would defer to an agency's interpretation of any ambiguity in a regulation. And that has shifted based on this Loper Bright case. Additionally, there was another case that came out of the Supreme Court right at the same time, the Corner Post case, that extended the period of a time that you could challenge a regulation. So if there's an interpretation of a regulation that you feel is harmful and needs to be challenged, the time period to do so was extended to 6 years from when you realize that harm has occurred. So I think of these cases as going hand in hand to really basically increase both the time and the ability for entities to challenge IRS or Treasury regulations, both new and old. So, when we talk about what industries should be keeping an eye on the tax and regulatory landscape generally, those are the ones that come to mind because there's so many regulations that impact what they do every day that if we see those challenged in the courts based on this expanding of power that I just mentioned from these Supreme Court cases, that can really tie up regulatory interpretation. It can lead to uncertainty. It can lead to companies not knowing what they're supposed to do when there's a regulation that's being challenged in the court, which we all know takes a lot of time. It can be appealed. That can take years to work through the court. So it's really going to expand potential uncertainty around those highly regulated industries. And I think the other thing to mention when we talk about what industries should really be keen on watching and preparing is just the general Republican focus on deregulation. So, this is something we obviously heard on the campaign trail from President-elect Trump. We've heard it from Republican legislators, both, at the state and federal level. But this idea that we want to have a lighter touch when it comes to regulatory affairs and regulations, both, for businesses to think about. When we think about Republican deregulation and those Supreme Court cases, I think we're going to see a lot of challenges to existing regulations across the board. So, in addition to potential changes at the congressional level, like we've been talking about today, you may also see a lot of headlines about regulations being challenged in the courts and what that could mean based on the new Supreme Court decisions that we are really kind of waiting to see what happens with those. So, all that to say, if you work in an industry, if your company or entity is in an industry that feels that regulatory burden, I would say, be prepared for some changes in that area in the next coming years.
That makes That makes a lot of sense. I feel like a kind of consistent theme is uncertainty, waiting to hear, unsure of where things might net out. And for businesses that we typically advise to plan ahead and be prepared and make a strategic long-term plan, for businesses that are dealing with this uncertainty, what are some practical things they can do right now to kind of be well positioned to to adjust to any potential changes to tax regulation or additional regulation that might come down the pipe as a result of the election?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think number one is staying informed, working with a team like us here at Bonadio, working with tax professionals, staying informed, making sure your finger is on the pulse of what's happening, because there is going to be the need to be flexible in this kind of changing legislative environment. And I think, importantly, consider if there's opportunities that you could seize now. One of the things that we help clients with often, I join a lot of calls about Inflation Reduction Act energy credits. If you've put in solar panels or an EV charger, there's credits out there for those things. The thing to keep in mind, as with a changing administration, there's the potential to roll back some of those initiatives, especially when we talk about green energy credits in the incoming administration. So think about what's out there right now that might be on the table that you could leverage, to optimize your position, your cash flow. Think about your debt structure. Think about how to minimize your current tax impacts. I talk a lot about tariffs, thinking a lot about what's going to happen with tariffs, looking at your supply chain, considering the potential impact of some of these provisions or some of these campaign proposals that we've heard. So, changing legislation is sometimes can be scary because it leads to uncertainty and you're not really sure what's next. But I'd also just encourage you to think of it opportunistically. What's out there? How can we benefit from what is out there, and how can we engage with our industry groups and our policymakers to advocate for policies that will benefit?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I feel like despite uncertainty, there are some practical things that people can do right now. And I think one of the biggest takeaways is don't miss the opportunity to take advantage of things that are currently in the realm of possibility, because there's not a guarantee that they're still going to be there come the next year or so. So
Yes, perfectly said. Yes.
yeah. So we've talked a lot so far about businesses and tax changes and potential regulation changes that impact businesses. But in reading one of your recent articles, you mentioned the preserving of increased estate tax and gift tax limits. So I'm just wondering, from a private wealth standpoint, if you have any insights on, estate taxes, gift taxes, changes or potential implications to that realm.
That's another big one to watch, and we have a team that works on that and is watching it, very closely. One thing that is really interesting to me in that realm is we are going to see Senator Thune step up as the Senate Majority Leader. Senator Thune has been quite outspoken about, his feelings against those estate and gift taxes that we see. So, that is a power player in the Senate and in tax policy generally. He is an old school George Bush style Republican that really is kind of against those estate and gift taxes. So I'm watching him specifically and watching what comes out of the Senate, because I really feel like with a leader like that at the helm as the Senate Majority Leader, who has, spoken quite publicly about his feelings there, I think it's really interesting to see what's going to happen. And, this is something that people really need to consider as they think about what is going to happen for estate planning, and big changes may be coming. So Yes, that is another one, Laura, that I would say we're in a wait and see period. But I will be watching Senator Thune to see, how he feels about this and what we see proposed, and what we see come out of committee markups on that.
For sure. And speaking of planning, as cliche as it is, planning is something that we're constantly talking about. Strategic planning, long-term planning, tax planning. And as businesses approach the end of the year, and as many businesses start to think about a new strategic plan or a new plan for 2025, what role does tax planning play in helping navigate the impacts of the election?
Yeah, yeah, it's huge. I mean, tax planning is huge. You're thinking not only about how can we mitigate risk, but how can we seize opportunity. So, trying to find those cost-effective strategies, both in the current environment and anticipating for any potential future changes, allows you to kind of align your business with potential legislative outcomes to really, again, mitigate risk and seize opportunity. So, I feel for our clients because it's been a really tough few years when it comes to tax planning. For example, in 2024, we saw a huge tax bill, the Tax Relief for American Families and Workers Act. That bill would have made changes to a whole bunch of the provisions that I spoke about earlier in our discussion. That would have adjusted a bunch of those Tax Cuts and Jobs Act provisions. That bill passed the House very early in 2024. We were ready for Senate action on that bill, and we sat and waited as the bill stalled in the Senate for the rest of the year. So there was no action there. It really made it very difficult to plan because there was all these potential changes, including some that would have been retroactive, that clients were waiting to see, is this going to happen? And it really makes tax planning difficult. So I think that's why you kind of really need a tax professional to be watching this for you, because, I mean, it's a lot in addition to, of course, your regular business to kind of watch and prepare for what might happen. So, a lot of patience, a lot of wait and see, but certainly being informed and at least knowing, what bills sit where and what is the likelihood. I think there is just so much value in that, that'll really allow you to kind of position yourself well for the coming years.
For sure. And I know you've written a couple more detailed articles that our listeners can take a look at right at bonadio.com, the impacts on various industries like financial services and just in general, and when it comes to tax and compliance and regulations. So if our viewer or our listeners want a more detailed dive into some of those stuff, absolutely check out some of Jess's recent content. Um, we've covered a lot of ground today, and I know it's a very intricate topic, and there's a lot of different nuances to the situation that you'll be watching. But if there's one thing you'd want listeners to remember or to take away from this discussion, what would it be?
It's a good question. I mean, I think it kind of has to be patience. Like I said, I've talked about this every day since the election. What's going to happen? What's going to happen? We obviously have more clarity now that we have the election results, but we still simply don't know. So we can talk about potential changes all day long, and I can and I do. But there has to be a little bit of patience because, like I said, what an incoming president or a member of Congress says that they want to do may be very different from what they actually can do given the constraints of our system. So, kind of finding that balance between being prepared, being informed, taking proactive steps, but also not jumping the gun. I work with so many clients who I help understand what the law is right now and what the changes may be, but being prepared and knowing that something might happen is very different from kind of taking action too soon. So you want to prepare, you want to plan, but you certainly don't want to jump the gun on something that, again, like we saw last year, might pass the House and then stall out in the Senate. So, yeah, being patient, I think, would be my number one takeaway.
Patience is certainly a virtue.
Yes, exactly.
Jess, we like to end our conversations by asking guests just for any recent podcast or book recommendation that they have. And it does not need to be related to accounting or the election or the regulatory landscape. It could really just be anything interesting that you've read or listened to lately. Do you have anything on your mind?
I mean, I knew you were going to ask this question because my favorite podcast is TBG Talks, obviously. So that's my number
Shameless
one
plug. Shameless
recommendation. Yeah.
plug. We love it.
Yeah, I mean, it's gotta be books because don't get me started on books. I'm insane. I am in 3 book clubs, which is objectively too many book clubs for one person to be in. Like that's not okay. So I usually have like a hard copy book going, an audio book going, and a Kindle book going. So I am like a crazy reader, I would say. So
What's your most recent book club book that you've read?
oh, good question. So I actually just finished one that was called Here One Moment, I think is what the title. And it was a Leanne Moriarty book that is, see, I told you, don't give me started. You're going to get a full plot review here, Laura. The Here One Moment was a really kind of interesting book where a woman on a plane makes predictions down the rows of all the passengers on the plane of when and how they will die. And then you kind of wait to see how they grapple with those predictions as they go about their real lives. It was a very interesting book, and I'm really looking forward to the book club discussion about it because yeah, that was a fun one. Um, my number one book that I recommend to people when I don't know what they like to read is Project Hail Mary. It's an Andy Weir book, and I have never recommended it to someone who hasn't come back to me and said, "Oh my God, I loved that book." So that's my always recommendation. I didn't even think I would like it. It's kind of sci-fi space. It's actually the same author who wrote The Martian, that was that movie with Matt Damon. Yeah. So it's similar vibes to that, but I absolutely love that book. And everyone I recommend it to loves it too. And actually, I think they're going to make this one into a movie too. So bonus, you get to watch the movie after you read it. Yeah.
I'll definitely be checking that out. I'm also
Yes, Project Hail Mary.
I'm also in a few book clubs, but mostly focused on the wine and snacking portion of the book club. But now I'll be able to
Yes.
come prepared with a very interesting recommendation. So,
Perfect. I love that.
well, thank you so much, Jess, for taking the time to chat with us today. I know so many businesses and individuals are grappling with planning based on the outcomes of the election. So this will be super helpful for our listeners, and really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you, Laura. This was so fun. And yeah, we're here to help through the craziness.
Absolutely. All right. Take care.
Thanks, Laura. Bye.
Well, that wraps up our interview with Jess Ladon. We hope you found this episode insightful and informative. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast for more episodes featuring our thought leaders. And if you're interested in checking out Jess's book recommendation, it has been linked on our Spotify as well as the TBG Talks page of our website. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.